Hello everyone, my name is Caio. I am a graduate student at the Compilers Lab at UFMG. And in this video, I should talk about a paper that we published at CGO 2026, which is called a Multidirectional Propagation of Sparsity Information Across Tensor Slices. This work was developed between research from UFMG and the University of Alberta. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about sparsity. So sparsity has been gaining a lot of attention recently, and there's a line of research that tries to propagate sparsity through deep learning models, and also there's been works that tries to estimate the sparsity of matrix expression. So in this work, we are interested in a specific kind of sparsity, which is a form of structured sparsity called slice sparsity. And slice sparsity happens when you have, for example, order 2 tensor, which is a matrix, and you have rows or columns that are entirely zero. In our order 3 tensor, you have planes that are fully zero. In a 4 order tensor, you have cubes that are entirely zero. And to illustrate why we care about slice sparsity and what can be done with that kind of sparsity, I wanted to give an example. So let's say that you have a tensor A, which is a matrix I by J, and you also have a matrix B, which is J by K, and you want to compute an expression using those two tensors. So this node represents an ISM expression, but it's just another way of writing matrix multiplication. So if I write the code and execute the code to compute that expression, that will give me also a matrix C. But before computing C, there's a few things that I know about C that are very interesting. So the first thing is that I know C's shape, and that's given by linear algebra, because I know that A is an I by J matrix and B is a J by K, so C has to be an I by K matrix. But there's more things that I can know about C by only looking to the current state of the graph. And the first thing that I can know is that the second row of C will be zero. And the reason behind that is because the second row of A is zero. And also I know that the third column of C will be zero because the third column of B is also zero. So what will happen when I compute that expression is that the sparsity of the dimensions of my input tensor will be propagated to the same dimension in my output tensor. And the same would happen for the dimension k in B, and that form of propagation is what we call forward propagation. So the sparsity of the input tensors are propagated to the output tensor. So I haven't computed C yet. I just know more information about C now, and say that I'll grab that tensor and I'll also multiply that to another tensor D. And this is again matrix multiplication. So if I zoom this in and take a deeper look of what will happen during this computation, now that I have more information about C, I know that since this is matrix multiplication, the first row of C will multiply all the columns of D. And if I pay attention, I know that the third position of the first row of C is zero, and that element will multiply the third row of D. And I know that result beforehand, so I know that multiplying that to the third element will result in a zero, and I also know that the same would happen for all the rows in C. And the reason behind this is that the third column of C is zero. So that gives me an interesting insight, which is that I don't actually need to store the third row of D, because that row will be nullified by the elements in C. So I can zero out that entirely row, because its only purpose is to participate in an expression that I know the result ahead of time. And since I know this sparsity, I also know that the last column of D is zero, and every element in C that will be touched by that row would also be nullified, would also result in a zero expression, and I can also propagate that information to C as well. So what will happen during this computation is that the sparsity of the shared dimensions between the tensors, they will be propagated from one to another. And that kind of propagation would call lateral propagation. So If I go back to my graph, again, I haven't computed C yet. I'm just reasoning about the information that I have available in the graph. And I just discovered that the last column of C will be 0 during after computing C. And one way of avoiding that column to be computed is to also nullify the elements that are responsible for computing that column. So I can propagate that information backwardly into the graph to the elements that are responsible for computing the last column of C. And in this case, will be the last column of B. And that form of propagation we call backward propagation. So the sparsity of my output dimensions, the dimensions of my output tensor is propagated backwardly to the input tensors. Um, so we have developed a sparsity analysis, a static analysis to propagate sparsity, which we call sparsity propagation analysis, or SPA. And SPA takes any dimensional tensors, and the analysis will compute a abstract state for each tensor, which will be a collection of what we call sparsity vectors. And a sparsity vectors, it's a collection of zeros and ones, and that vector will have the same size of the dimension. And if a position in that vector, for example, a position j, is set to be 0, I know that I can treat the entirely slice j in dimension I as 0, and that will have no semantic impact in my computational graph, which makes SPA a must analysis. So I know that I can treat the entire slice as 0, and that will have no effect in the result of the graph. So I will show how the analysis works. To start, we will assign sparsity vectors for each dimension of the tensor A. Since this is a matrix, it only has two sparsity vectors, one for dimension I and another for dimension J. And since I know A's sparsity, I will set the second position of the sparsity vectors for dimension I in A to 0, because the second row of A is 0. So the same would happen for B, and the third position of the vector for dimension K of B will be 0, matching the third column of B, which is also 0. So I'll show how the forward propagation analysis works. I start by renaming the sparsity vectors to the name of my tensor. And if I go back to my initial graph, I only know C's shape. And so I'll start by assigning sparsity vectors for each dimension of C, one vector per dimension. And those vectors, they will be initialized with ones. And a 1 in SPA doesn't mean that slice doesn't have zeros. It means that I don't know anything about the sparsity of that slice. So since this is the forward propagation, I'll be propagating the sparsity from my input dimensions to my output dimensions. So I'll start by grabbing the sparsity vector for dimension I in A, and also my initial assumption about C sparsity, which is that I don't know anything about C sparsity. And I will do a logical AND between the two, and that will give me a new sparsity vector, which will carry the sparsity from the input dimension I to the output dimension I in C. In a similar way, I will grab the sparsity vectors for K. K only appears in B, so I'll grab my initial assumption of the sparsity in dimension K for C, and again I will do a logical AND between the two, and that will propagate the sparsity from the columns of B to the columns of C. So we raised a couple of research questions about this analysis. So the first one is, what is the analysis runtime? How much sparsity can the analysis propagate? And is there any performance improvement, any benefit by propagating those zeros? So to answer those questions, we implemented the analysis on top of the Taco compiler, and we used the Einstein benchmark to build our computational graphs. So for the analysis runtime, we wanted to compare how much time is taken to execute the analysis compared to compiling and executing the graph. So we grabbed 12 benchmarks from the Einstein collection, and here we are comparing the runtime of the analysis, compilation, and execution of the graph, and this is a log scale plot. These are the results. As you can see, the analysis in green, it's always faster than and compiling and executing the computational graph. In some cases, the analysis can be up to 7 orders of magnitude faster than executing the computational graph. And the reason behind this stems from two facts. The first one is that we have a very lightweight representation for the sparsity of vectors. So each tensor will have a sparsity vector per dimension, and the sparsity vector is implemented as a bit set. So the sparsity in the slice is represented by using a single bit. And the second thing is that we show that this analysis can reach a fixed point after a single execution of the propagation in forward, lateral, and backward direction, and that's enough to propagate all the sparsity available in the graph. So here we want to see how much sparsity we can propagate. So we start by with our graph and its initial sparsity, but no propagation in gray. And then we have the same graph, but augmented with the analysis only using the forward direction, then forward plus backward, forward and lateral, and finally in green, the same graph after running the analysis in all the directions. Again, the same 12 benchmarks, but this time we are comparing the amount of sparsity we have in the computational graph. These are the results. There's always a jump from gray, which means no analysis, to the other colors. And in some cases, we are able to see an increase in sparsity from 27% to 84%. And in a specific benchmark, which is benchmark 9, you can see that there's very little increase between red and the other colors. And the reason behind this is that these particular benchmarks, the tensors have very few shared dimensions. So that prevents lateral propagation from happening, which also prevents backward propagation from discovering new sparsity. So finally, we want to see what can be done with the analysis. And one straightforward idea is that if you can propagate more zeros through your computational graph, then you can switch its representation from a dense data structure to a compressed data structure. And we want to see how much memory we can save by doing that. So here we have our experiments divided in two configurations. In light colors, you have the original graph with its initial sparsity, which goes from 30% to 90%. And in solid colors, you have the same graph after running the analysis, so there's propagation happening in solid colors. The same 12 benchmarks, but now we are comparing the size of the tensors normalized to the dense implementation, and these are the results. So as you can see, we're able to reduce the tensor memory consumption in the majority of cases. In some cases, at very high levels of sparsity, we're able to see more than 80% reduction in memory consumption. In benchmark 9, there's no reduction because there's very little shared dimensions between the tensor, which prevents lateral propagation from discovering non-trivial sparsity between the tensors, which prevents memory reductions. So to conclude, we have implemented a multidirectional analysis. The analysis supports any dimensional tensors and a set of different math operators, such as INSUM, element-wise multiplications, additions. And the analysis can be quite fast, way faster than executing the computational graph. In some cases, we're able to see 57% in increase of sparsity in the entire graph. And we also were able to show up to 80% memory reduction. So that's it. This is the QR code for the paper. And obrigado.